Okay, so hi everybody. Welcome. Thank you for joining our webinar. Um, I don't think I know you guys. So I'm Adam Pertman. I'm the president and co-founder of the National Center on Adoption and Permanency. Um, Please take a look at our website. I'm not going to give you a full elevator speech on who we are and what we do, but the bottom line for NCAP is that our mission is to move adoption related and broadly speaking, child welfare related policy and practice from its current model, the current paradigm, which is all about child placement, right? Let's get every kid into a safe, permanent, and loving family. To move from that paradigm to one that is measured by family success. So that resources and education, Kimara, the stuff that you're doing, they become part of the fabric of the process rather than post-adoption services or pre-adoption services, or they should all be a seamless web of education, resources, and services so that families have a real shot. The way I describe it in the child welfare world, the mantra is every child deserves to have a safe, permanent, and loving family. No argument with that. Um, but what every child really deserves is to have a safe, permanent, loving, and successful family, whatever that may mean for that family. And we don't build those factors into the system. And so NCAP's mission is to try to accomplish that, is to work to accomplish that in families of origin when possible and in new families when necessary. So that's NCAP briefly. Do all of you already know Kimara, or should I give you a little of her bio? I guess I should just do that for recording's sake. Actually, you know what, Kimara, I don't need to do that. You know who you are and what you bring to the table. Why don't I just turn this over to you? Introduce yourself briefly, and then go into your presentation. And we'll be back. We'll take questions at the end, and then Dr. Dana Johnson is going to say a few words about the ICAR conference that he is hosting next month. And with that, Kamara.
Yeah, thank you, Graham. So I'm Kimara Gustafson. I am a pediatrician and one of the providers at the Adoption Medicine Clinic based here at University of Minnesota in the Department of Pediatrics. So in our clinic, we see kids who have joined their current family through adoption and or foster care, and kind of there's varying degrees of what kind of their permanency looks like when they come to our clinic. Some of them might be in a permanent placement, some of them might be in temporary, and then transitioning to either a kinship placement or non-relative or reunification. And so we work with a multidisciplinary team with myself, a pediatrician, occupational therapist who's looking at things from a developmental standpoint, and then a pediatric psychology team is looking from social emotional. And so kind of as that whole team, we have that kind of trauma-informed lens of trying to, the adage of kind of all the blind men and the elephant, trying to kind of make sure that we are looking at the child and kind of their home environment in as holistic a sense as we can, to try to figure out kind of the best recommendations and resources for those kids and to help their families, either if they're kind of temporary or permanent, be as successful as possible kind of in the near and far future. And I'll talk a little bit about kind of my background in the talk, but just my quick kind of Cliff Notes version. I came to some of this work because I do have personal interest, and then I am a Korean adoptee. I was adopted as an infant from South Korea to my adoptive parents who were based out in New York at the time. So I grew up in upstate New York, and then I came to Minnesota for medical school, and I've been here ever since. We have such a small group today that we will have time at the end, obviously, for questions, but if you have questions kind of during the talk, feel free to throw them in the chat. And also, if you wouldn't mind maybe putting in the chat kind of your either professional or kind of personal connection to the talk, and then that way I can have a better sense of instead of just kind of talking at you for 45 minutes of terms of like if there are certain things that you guys have interest, we can spend a little bit more time on. And while you guys are doing that, I will get my talk. Oh, I think it looks like I need to be able to share my screen. Slideshow. And can you all see this okay? Or someone just holler if you can't?
Yes.
Okay.
Good.
Wonderful. So today I'm talking about what race has to do with it, and specifically kind of how do we help to promote and support positive identity development for transracial and transcultural composed families. And I'll talk a little bit about kind of what I mean when I use those words, transracial and transcultural. I don't have any disclosures with this material. And hopefully by the end of the talk, the goals would be kind of understanding what I'm calling the paradox of transracial, transcultural composed families, looking at racial identity development through the early life ages, and then looking from how do we move from a colorblind to a positive racial cultural identity formation model, specifically as the adults that are kind of in the support community or support system for these children that we work with or that are in our lives. I always like to start with kind of, as I alluded to, I'm a Korean adoptee, and so kind of my birth story. And when we think about birth stories for a lot of people in the community, if they're with their biological families, that usually starts at the time of their birth, and they can go back and hear details about, you know, were they born in a hospital, were they born at home, you know, what time of day, you know, who was present, kind of how did it go. And there's all these details that I think we don't necessarily think are important unless you are, I think, within the adoption or foster care community. And I think that personally, for me, there's all these details that I felt like were and are still missing. And so my birth story, when we think about birth story, actually kind of started at the airport. I was adopted from Korea when I was 7 months old. I was placed with a foster family in Korea for the first many months of my life. But really, the stories that I hear from my adoptive parents didn't start until kind of middle of February in 1980 when I arrived at the airport coming off the jetway. And this was a social worker that was carrying me. And so it was myself and a handful, I think it was like 2 or 3 other infants from Korea that came, and all of our kind of receiving and expecting families and extended relatives were there. And so kind of that gives you a little bit of background about me, but in terms of why I came to the work, you know, I think went through certain kind of life events that are maybe could be shared for some of the Korean adoptees that live in the Minnesota area, that we have kind of the unique nature of there's a larger adoptee community here for Korean adoptees. And so I was really fortunate to be able to go to Korean culture camps and Korean adoptee sleepaway camps. And that helped to kind of inform me a little bit about kind of who I wanted to take on of who I am and how do I identify. But it really wasn't until I became a parent and I now have 3 mixed kids. My husband is not adopted. He's Scandinavian, kind of white Minnesotan. And that my kids were starting to get older, and I realized, oh my gosh, they're going to have some similar experiences that I might have had when I was a kid. And I worry that they're going to have kind of this, like make the same mistakes essentially that I kind of made, and that, you know, quote unquote, that my parents made. But here's this opportunity, like when we know more and we can know, you know, be better, then why don't we do better? And so as a parent now, I have this opportunity to be a little bit more proactive or a little bit more informed about kind of my interaction and my children's interaction with race and racial identity than I was maybe at that age. And so before I kind of launch into all of that, I want to just think about when we think about identity, kind of the factors that are typically assigned to that. And feel free to kind of throw it in the chat if you want. But when I think about it, I think about, memories that we have and that are forming kind of experiences that are helping to shape those memories, the relationships that are kind of influencing those experiences and the memories. And then how does that all kind of come together in this formation of your sense of self, and how is that shaping what we consider identity? And then kind of that is all in the context of how do we then relate to those around us, or how do those around us are kind of task us to relate to them. So, and I apologize, I know I asked you guys to, well, now I can't even see it. Oh, here we go. Kind of put in where you guys are coming from. But and so this might be a little bit redundant or information that you guys already know, but when we think about race and ethnicity, they're oftentimes kind of interchanged. I think it can be confusing. Race is a social construct that was created, and so when we think about it from kind of a biologic or scientific standpoint, there's not really a specific reasoning that we have different races. Ethnicity, I think, is more connected to kind of your cultural point of origin or kind of your familial cultural kind of context. But I wouldn't necessarily kind of ding you if you're confused, because this is the census race question from 2020. So this, they're framing it as, what is this person's race, when they're trying to kind of classify us as individuals living in this country. And, they break it down into kind of white, Black or African American, American Indian, or kind of indigenous and Alaska Native. And then they give you all of these, what they're classifying as race, but they're actually countries, right? They're country of origin or country of familial origin. So completely understanding that this is all very confusing and kind of easily interchanged to create more confusion. And then kind of when we take a step back from that, all we think about, how do we explain it to kids, right? If we're confused as the adults, do we have any hope when we're trying to explain it to, a classroom of first or second graders? So when we look kind of officially at racial socialization, so that part of the identity that is, connected to kind of race and what we consider of kind of racial description or kind of racial identifiers, it is part of our social identity. It kind of shapes how we see ourselves in relation to others. I would argue too that it shapes how others are viewing us, kind of the assumptions that people might make based on what they think our race is or our racial kind of identity is. And then influences the groups that we feel we might belong to and that we think are important. And so again, kind of our influences of that, parents, families, friends, education, teachers, and the media experiences, and kind of the religious or community leaders. One thing I want to highlight with the influences of socialization, if we think about it, is it kind of starts really in that kind of family or that close core, and then kind of starts to grow out of there. So your influences start, in that center, and then kind of start to expand as your sense of community expands as a child. So I want to kind of allude to, again, getting back to my own story of this concept that I call kind of the age of othering. And when I was talking about part of, the reason that I came to this was, as being a parent and seeing my kids starting to recognize kind of what they might be going through. And when I talk about the age of othering, what I mean is that at some point as a young child, especially as a child who might not look the same as the peers in their kind of community, at their school or at the playground or at the park, that there is going to be a point at which they will maybe that difference will be kind of pointed out to them. And usually it's by other kids. So these are some examples of questions that, I've either had asked of me or that I've seen observed kids asking each other, of kind of, where are you from? The assumption being not from this country, or, why do you wear that thing on your head? Or, do you know that other kid? Because he looks like you too. Or kind of things that, I'm going to be the princess, you can be a maid, and that there's a value kind of associated with those roles. And these are all kind of around this concept that kids are trying to organize, and then also trying to kind of classify, are we the same or are we different? And if we're different, usually that can come with some, again, positive or negative association of, if we're different and I think I'm better, or I think you're better, et cetera, et cetera. So when we look at, and I can kind of gloss over this because my guess is you guys know this, but when we look at kind of the demographics and why I think this is important, that there are, in 2004, there were over 20,000 children were born outside of this country that then joined the family of parents, American parents. And in 2019, there were over 100,000 children in the foster care system that had that goal of permanency that would not be reunification, so either kinship or non-relative. And then when we look at the demographics of children that are adopted, they're less likely to be white or Hispanic or Latinx origin, and they're more likely to be Black when we compare it to the US population. So here's a New York Times article, and when we think about adoption and adoptive families, I think this is kind of a niche group for you guys. So but generally when I give this talk, I kind of ask this question of, like, when you think about an adoptive family, kind of what kind of family pops to your mind? And this is, I think, an interesting example because DeMarcus Ware is a NFL football player, and he and his wife decided to adopt a little girl who is of a different race. She's white. And so it kind of, if you were to look up kind of Google his family, there's a lot of questions of, like, is that his daughter? And this all, I think, goes back to this assumption that, like, well, shouldn't his child look like him? But then on the flip side, when we think about adoption and adoptive families historically, like when I put this into kind of Google as an image search, more likely, and I think this is maybe when kind of our bias and kind of where our brains go to, is we think of an adoptive family, we think of white parents, or at least one white parent, and we're adopting children of color. And so again, kind of reinforces those statistics that we just looked at, that these are families that are more likely going to be what I call transracial or transculturally composed, where the kids and the parents don't necessarily look the same. And so when we ask parents kind of if they've talked to their children about race and racism, especially in the context of a family where visually that there are going to be physical differences, a lot of parents just say, well, it really hasn't come up. And as a pediatrician, I like to use the example of, well, what if we use that same kind of answer or kind of thought process to other things that we think about that children need support through? So specifically like toilet training or learning how to swim or learning how to ride the bike, that if we kind of only put the burden on the child to say, hey, you know what, I'm really ready to use the toilet just like everyone else, it might be a while. Or if they're like, I really am just ready to try to ride a bike, again, it might be a lot later than kind of what we societally have thought would be a good time to start to make suggestions, start to have conversations, start to kind of put in some practices of, like, let's talk about this, let's get, interested in it, and prepare our bodies to try something new. So when we think about kind of that age of othering, and we think about settings that a child might be encountering kind of this concept of race or racialized experiences, and specifically it's pointed out to them how they might look different. These are occurring in schools, from the media, in the playground if they're with other peers, and sports and activities, in the home, especially with our families that are come together through adoption and foster care. And then, from my standpoint, from a professional standpoint, in the clinic or the hospital setting. And when we think about kind of when do kids start to really recognize race and kind of racial or physical differences, there's research out there by Dr. Kelly and his team that looks at that they think that as early as 3 months old, and here's a picture of one of my kids when he's 3 months old, that they can start to prefer or kind of see differences. And what I wanted to use for this, to point out with this article, is that this is actually a misnomer in the title, because it says 3 months old, prefer own race faces, but the study was done with all biological infants and mothers. They were recruited from a maternity hospital. So what really it should say is that 3 months old prefer the race face of their primary caregiver, so of their mother at the time. And so if you have a child who's adopted or joins kind of their family early on in those early infancy months, but looks different than their primary caregiver, they're going to start to show preferences of other faces that are similar to that primary caregiver. So what happens to that child when they start to look in mirrors and they see a face that's reflected back that doesn't look like their face of preference? So caregivers and professionals, babies are little sponges, and we all of us when we were a baby were kind of pre-programmed to take information in and try to incorporate it and try to learn from it and kind of grow our brains. So here's this opportunity to really start from kind of day one to provide good information for these kids. And so, obviously I have kind of my opinion, but when is it too young to talk about race? I think that a lot of times, historically we've heard, well, they're so innocent, we don't want to kind of burden them with conversation that is adult conversation, or we don't really know how to kind of talk to them in a way that makes sense. Some of it, I think, is that when we think about it from an adult standpoint, from a child's perspective, race and racism doesn't really make sense, right? And kids are kind of perfect at that. If you ask them something and something doesn't make sense, they just keep wanting to ask questions, which is like such a superhero power, I think, of kids. But from the parent perspective or the adult perspective, you're like, oh, crud, because now I have to keep answering these questions and I don't have a good answer. And I kind of joke that in my house, sometimes we'll talk about things and my kids will say, well, but why? And but why? And that usually we just kind of come back to, well, because we live in a racialized society and racism as a concept exists. And so it doesn't always make sense. And it's not always right. But that is kind of maybe the underlying root answer for why this interaction just happened, or why something happened that that kind of when we're trying to think about this dichotomy of good or bad, that it's not as clear cut as that. And so what we did at our clinic, or what I did was I took kind of that schematic we were just looking at, kind of the ages and stages of where kids are in terms of understanding the concept of race and understanding kind of racial identity of themselves and of others. And I put it next to, we were just talking early on about kind of how do we translate some of our research work into kind of an applicable resource that can be used. And this is an example of, I put together this worksheet of, okay, here's what we know from the research of what kids at different ages, as early as 3 months, 2, 2.5, 4, 5, getting into elementary school, how do they understand race? And then what can we do? We're not just kind of standing by letting them do this on their own. We have opportunities to get in there, to intervene, to be proactive, and to support them maybe in a more positive way when it comes to race and their racial identity, but in an age-appropriate way, recognizing that these are kind of, I think, the time in their life when we have a chance to intervene. And what I want to highlight here is that when we look at 7+ years old, they're pretty fixed. And so unless we have kind of explicit conversations with kind of the way that they view race and kind of make sense of differences in race is pretty fixed. And so that they start to kind of try to make sense of the world based on that construct that they have created. And that's, second grade. I feel like historically that's when a lot of provider or parents and community members are like, well, second grade is too young. Let's have conversations with these kids when they're in 5th grade, 6th grade, 7th grade. By that point, I think it's way too late because they're so fixed and they've already had 3, 4, 5 years to kind of just dig in and try to rationalize some of the things that maybe if we had had conversations about it when they were 3, 4, 5, or 6, we could have had a little bit more influence on, how they're organizing their world. And when we think about from kind of a psychosocial development standpoint, that kind of going from the infant stage all the way up to, kind of young adult, again, in that 5th, 6th, and 7th grade, that's really when, looking at kind of a teenager in this ladder, that's where they are really starting to grapple with their sense of identity. Who am I? How do I relate to the people closest to me? So my family. How do I relate to those around me? So my friends and my peers. And then how do I start to relate within kind of the larger community? And if they haven't really had a lot of support leading up to that teenage period and that kind of identity period, I think it has the potential of creating risk that it's not necessarily a healthy development through their own identity development, that it could be kind of where they start to have what we call kind of that identity crisis. And we think about race and racism, the impact on them, either if they're recognizing it directly or if it's kind of occurring around them. We know that from research, this is a statement from the American Academy of Pediatrics, that there is a measurable impact of racism on a child and adolescent health. And so it is something from a professional standpoint, as a pediatrician, it's something that I think about regularly for the kids that we see in our clinic. And talking about kind of that identity crisis or identity development stage, there is a podcast called Code Switch where they did an episode on transracial adoptees. And these are just some quotes that I pulled from it, that I spent the first 12 years of my life thinking I was this little white girl. So thinking back to that infant and they're looking at kind of their primary caregiver, what happens when this 12-year-old kind of keeps looking in the mirror and she's surprised or maybe feels a little bit rejected in the sense of her reflection is not how she kind of views herself internally. And the next one being the lack of identity is what ties transnational adoptees together. And then the last one is my language, my mannerisms, my experiences are all informed by the white family I grew up with. So again, when we think back to kind of that formation of identity, the influences starting from the center of my family and kind of spiraling out, if all of that is a context that is maybe a little bit dissimilar from kind of the way in which physically you might be received in the world, like I'm being received as an Asian woman, but I grew up in kind of an American white family, how do I kind of help those two things to reconcile? So the role of the parents, or, I would say kind of, I use the term parents in the broader sense of just kind of who are the grownups that are helping to support these kids. in their kind of social system of just first thing recognizing we live in a racialized social society. And I say this with from a place of love. Again, I'm a parent and I'm a pediatrician, but if we really think about it, kids are mean. They don't mean to be mean, but what they're doing, again, when we think about those ages and stages, is they are saying what they are being taught by adults around them, but without the filter of what can we say out loud and what do we just think in our head. They'll just say it out, loud. So like, gosh, look at that person, they have funny looking hair, or, that person is fat, or that person has, is wearing an ugly shirt. They kind of say it out loud, and they don't necessarily mean to be mean, like I said. And we kind of socialize that out of them in the sense that they aren't saying it out loud, but it doesn't mean that they're not thinking it. But when we think about from like on a playground perspective, is these kids that are in these families are going to be at risk of having these interactions without that filter. And so how do we, if they say, something directly to the kid, like, I want you to be the maid, I'm going to be the princess, how do we prepare them to understand what that might mean? And then more importantly, how do we prepare them to be able to have a good rebuttal of like, well, I'm not going to be the maid, let's both be princesses, or I don't want to play your game. It's normal for kids to notice differences and to have questions about those differences. So again, another example that I use frequently is that if a kid says, oh, look, mom, there's a black man, and as the grown-up, you immediately shh, but you don't explain it. And, we shouldn't be shushing them anyway, but if you feel self-conscious about your child pointing out physical, or what we now, can say would be like a racial difference of someone, they will, and not explaining it, they will kind of start to maybe mistakenly assume that that's a negative, that there's something wrong with being black, that we shouldn't point it out, that that's rude, which is probably not what's the intent of that interaction, but it is potentially the outcome without explanation. Especially for our families that are transracially or transculturally composed, and the parents and the kids don't necessarily look the same. I think it's really important to believe your child's lived experience. So if they think that they're being targeted because of the way they look, or because of, their place of origin, to not dismiss it. Oh, that's probably not what they meant. That's probably not what they were saying. But to kind of give them space to think through it and hear it, and to support them and say, I'm sorry that happened to you, And then again, making sure that we provide mirrors and windows. And when I mean that would be, that things that look the same as them, but also things that maybe look different, but then helping to explain those differences in a way that's open and inclusive, so that they're not going to kind of start to make their own kind of conclusions from some of those differences. And then the biggest one for this, I think, is that this conversation is not a one and done. So this is not, that we have to kind of cram the whole history of, the United States and our racialized society into one conversation, or that this is, that you have to make sure that your kid is, has a good positive racial identity after one conversation. This is something, again, that should be sprinkled throughout, I think, starting from infancy all the way through their life. And it might kind of come up and down at different points for different reasons, but something that can be ongoing. And I think most importantly, just letting the kids know this is a conversation or a topic that we can always talk about whenever you want to, or whenever you need to. And I'm kind of open and here to help support you. I know Dr. Johnson's going to talk a little bit about the end, but I just wanted to do a quick highlight. This is Dr. Choi is a med student, or just graduated, so he's a pediatrician. He's going to be out on the East Coast, but he presented some of the work, specifically some of the work we did with the worksheet at a recent conference. And he will be presenting at ICAR this summer that Dr. Johnson will talk a little bit about as well. So there are definitely resources available if you feel like this isn't something that you're 100% familiar with or comfortable talking about. There are things to look at. The one thing I want to highlight with a lot of the resources, again, this paradox of the transracially composed family is a lot of resources I think are geared towards families with the assumption that the parents and the kids are going to look the same. And so it takes some creativity to try to figure out how do we access resources that are kind of has the language for a family that maybe everyone kind of comes to it from a different kind of place of origin. One that I do like to highlight that has information about this kind of community specifically is Embrace Race. They have resources looking at transracial and transcultural families composed through adoption and foster care. And then one that's local, I like to give a shout out is Little Moments Count. It's a podcast. It's through Minnesota Public Radio, and it's just a great one to kind of listen to on your commute, or if you are kind of out on your bicycle or jogging, things like that. There's also PBS has a lot of kind of videos available. There's a documentary looking at specifically kind of that concept of for within the African American community of, what do the conversation, kind of the quote unquote, the talk that parents have with their children of color, especially their sons, but how to kind of behave when you're stopped by police or by people of kind of governmental authority. And then this is a kind of more lighter, but kind of thinking about those mirrors and windows, looking at literature that, kind of reflects the people and kind of shows them themselves in media. And so diverse books is a good resource. And then just these are some ones on kind of Instagram or other social media that I think are one easy to follow and kind of you can look to see what they're suggesting. And kind of reasons why I think that this is important. Ideally, if we can get comfortable enough to have these conversations, I think it would be great if we could be having some of these conversations daily or, on a regular basis, helping to validate these experiences that kids are having. I think that it helps them to feel more confident just in general, but specifically in kind of their appearance and how they're being received. It creates that ongoing kind of relationship of trust between caregivers and the kids in their lives. And then when we talked about, from how do they interact with potentially negative events, that having kind of a good offense is the best defense. If they are prepared that, someone's going to try to touch their hair or comment on their hair, that you say, you can't touch my hair, that is special to me. Or if someone says, what are you what's that funny shirt that you're wearing? Well, it's like, I love this shirt. It was given to me by, so-and-so. And so I can be more confident about ignoring your negative comments on my appearance. And I think all of this leads into when we think about kind of that preteen, teenage, adolescence, and into early adult, that there's better chances that they have a kind of positive social identity development versus kind of that risk of identity crisis. And so just to kind of wrap it up and kind of come back full circle, I think about, my birth story and kind of coming into JFK. And I think about, gosh, when I was younger as a kid, I used to think, well, that's kind of when my life started. I was 7 months old. I was so little. I was a baby. I didn't really have any words or memories. But again, as I was saying, some of this work has been really inspired by becoming a parent, because when I became a parent and I realized by the time that my kids each reached the age of 7 months old, here my middle son's already been on the plane a couple of times by that point. So much has happened in their life from birth to 7 months. I'm just like patting myself on the back that they're still alive by 7 months, because it's not easy keeping little babies alive. But now it helps me to kind of have this new or a broader sense of all those things that was kind of helping to shape how my brain was making sense of the world in those first 7 months before I joined my forever family, and kind of the opportunities that we have for the kids that we work with in our community, that even from the get-go, if we're able to support them from birth on, all these things that we can be doing in a better and kind of hopefully more informed manner. And I think that is it. I'll turn it over to Dana for these last 2 slides.
Thank you very much, Kimara, for a really wonderful presentation.